Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Shawna Follis, and I'm a clinical instructor of medicine at Stanford Prevention Research Center, Stanford University. I'm honored to have recently received the K99R00 grant from NHLBI. So today I'll talk to you about my research on quantifying potentially modifiable structural determinants of health. These, for example, are policy, sociocultural factors that may be important to cardiovascular disease outcomes in order to achieve health equity. Before getting to my research, I'll introduce my positionality, which is the ontological lens through which I approach health equity research. My current research is informed by my multidisciplinary training that draws methodologically from epidemiology, from data science, and this is anchored to my anthropological background and my community cultural knowledge. My K99 research maps geospatial societal inequality. So I adapted a map of county level neighborhood SES just to show you all my educational journey here. So if you follow me through this map, my research began as a first-gen college graduate in Indiana. I attended college on a soccer scholarship and fortuitously discovered research through anthropology. I was drawn to this research because the group researched Quechua indigenous prehistory in Peru, which is my ancestral group and where my family's from. This informs my expertise in anthropology and instructional racism. I have a Master of Science degree from Purdue in anthropology and a PhD in epidemiology from the University of Arizona, which is a Hispanic Serving Institute. Most recently, I was a postdoc at Stanford until receiving the K99 award and transitioned me to clinical instructor in medicine. So let's get into the research part. I'll define health disparities. A health disparity population is characterized by a pattern of poor health outcomes across a variety of important leading causes of death. These are indicated by overall incidence, prevalence, morbidity, mortality, survival in the population when compared to the general population in the US for my research. For example, this chart from the CDC is showing that there's growing health disparities in life expectancy, and we can see this difference primarily impacts American Indian, Black Americans due to the historical inequalities that occurred in the US, and it's growing as well among the Latinx population. What we can see is that in 2021, American Indian and Alaska Native folks lived an average of 18.3 years fewer than Asian Americans. These racial health disparities have come to the public discourse through glaring COVID-19 disparities in the past few years, but what is less known is that these disparities are primarily attributed to cardiovascular disease, which has remained the leading cause of death even through COVID-19 pandemic. As we see here, heart disease, just one cardiovascular disease outcome alone is 3 times greater than COVID-19. We also see stroke and other CVD outcome incidence as 5th in this chart. So that frames why cardiovascular disease risk factor prevention is central to ameliorating health disparities and achieving health equity in the US. The CDC lists CVD risk factors here. These are the top ones that they list. As we can see, all of these fit into this, into the figure I have on my screen, which is WHO framework for social determinants of health. And they really fit cleanly as an intermediary determinant. And in fact, they're all more or less behavioral and biological factors. However, more recently, we've kind of expanded this framework and to show that this whole column of structural determinants of health are important upstream factors that shape, pattern, and are fundamental causes of these downstream behavior and biological risk factors. This WHO theoretical framework describes the structural determinants of health. And a lot of my research has focused on this throughout my career. So during my master's research, I looked at intermediary determinants of health, so measures of skeletal markers of psychosocial stress. My PhD research moved upstream to understanding stress from social environments. And one publication I'm highlighting here shows that social strain, which is a measure of social stress, is associated with osteoporosis through decreasing bone mineral density. My current research follows the more recent epidemiological prioritization of structural determinants of health, such as these social policies, public policies. And so getting into the current research, our invited state-of-the-art review in the Journal of American College of Cardiology last year summarized contributions from the Women's Health Initiative cohort since the inception of the cohort began enrolling participants nearly 30 years ago in the 1990s. My section of this review found that, like most large epidemiological cohort studies, there is strong prospective evidence of intermediary level determinants of health, things such as income and psychosocial stress that I highlighted before. And these are using really high quality clinical CBD endpoints, which is important to determining causality and strength of evidence. But what we lack evidence on structural social determinants of health. In fact, my next paper found that structural level determinants and structural racism research is limited by appropriate data. Studies using administrative big data sets, such as the US Census, have successfully quantified structural racism measures, but most analyses are limited to descriptive and cross-sectional analyses. Our next paper called for the WHI to apply data justice approaches, considering the cohort was born from NIH policy for equitable inclusion of women and racial and ethnic minority groups in the 1990s. Taking action on this goal, my next paper used neighborhood socioeconomic status as a solution to achieve structural racism measures in the WHI. The NSES index summarizes census variables to define resource deprivation in participant neighborhoods. And as we can see here, in the US, race is a defining characteristic of spatial and resource inequality, with more Black, American Indian, and Latina US people living in resource-deprived neighborhoods. So we can see here, Black people live in neighborhoods that are 5 standard deviations below the population mean. This is compared to white, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and Asian populations that live in much higher NSES neighborhoods. So therefore, a current paper in progress is evaluating my hypothesis that these racial and ethnic disparities in neighborhood SDS are prospectively associated with increased visceral adipose tissue. And this is characterized as bad fat. So we're looking at a really important cardiovascular disease risk factor. And what we found is, in fact, people living in lower neighborhood socioeconomic status do have higher visceral fat patterning compared to subcutaneous fat patterning, even after controlling for subcutaneous fat. This is true across all race and ethnicity groups, except for the Asian group. But we know that the AIN, American Indian, Black, and Latina groups have much higher exposure to NSES. Next, I'll get into my K99R00 research. It similarly uses a geospatial measure of inequality, this time the Social Vulnerability Index. And I'm using some amazing data from the WHI on cardiovascular disease incidence in order to look at CVD outcomes. So as an example of what I'll do in my K99 research, the Social Vulnerability Index is a measure of structural and racial inequality. This is a map of SVI in our local Bay Area, with darker colors representing a lower social vulnerability index. I chose this because it's a potentially modifiable CVD risk factor, so my results will inform policy. Therefore, I'm employing a gene computation method to estimate causal effects of a hypothesized social vulnerability intervention on cardiovascular disease risk factors. Going into the rest of my grant, I am proposing 4 other new structural variables that I will add to the WHI cohort, and these are all gathered from big administrative data sets like the US Census. Also, taking advantage of cohort data allows us to look at intermediary variables on the causal framework, like psychosocial stress, and how those are related to the association between structural to CVD outcomes. Finally, getting into my research program over the next 5 years. Following my K99 research, I am developing a R01 that takes advantage of this research that I created, that I've added to WHI, and um, and research has been added to other large cohort studies in order to combine data from cohort studies and look at subpopulations like race within Latinidad, like Black subgroups, knowing that Black Africa is the most diverse continent in the nation. So disaggregating these groups is really important to my future research. I'm also collaborating on a PO1 grant in development that extends on WHI to look at generational social determinants of health. And I would be the early career investigator on this. In summary, thank you all for listening, and especially thank you to my mentors, my co-authors, and to NextGen as well. And here's my contact information.